And Geithner is sitting on the top of that institution. Now, so far we don't have, as far as I know anyway, we don't have emails that have Geithner's name on it. But these are all his stooges, his underlings, his staff, his appointees, people working for Geithner and taking orders from Geithner did this stuff.
And he's using, Webster, we got a break. We'll come back and continue. He's using the mafia defense of, oh, that was my underlings that committed these murders, or that was my underlings that robbed these banks. He's saying, I know nothing. Though he was setting the policies as the head of the Fed, lobbying for him, and then as the head of the Treasury Department. Then we have the separate issues of them selectively using federal regulators they controlled, seizing competition banks, and then feeding and dumping all their debt into there. I mean, there's just so many crimes they're committing. We'll go over more of the crimes and where this is going. We're going to continue with the scams they pulled, then how we prosecute them, how we go after these criminals, because they're not going to stop here. They're the ones setting up Northcom. They're the ones running the phony environmental movements, grabbing the property. They openly finance it all. This is the New World Order. This is the globalist. And when we say the Anglo-American establishment, that's what they call themselves. It doesn't mean white people. It means the U.S. British elite power axis, London and Wall Street. I get emails all the time going, why are you talking about Anglos? That's not what it is. It means that geographic, those cities. Now, Webster, going back to you here, you were going through Geithner claiming he knows nothing about it, though they've got their people in all the positions. They're setting the policies. He moves into Treasury, continues the 100 cents on the dollar scam. And then separately we have them. You said at the time, and now it's been confirmed, Goldman Sachs was gunning the whole time for Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, and others that they use government power to shut down and eat. That's criminal right there. I mean, it's all crime.
Yeah, I think the most obvious crime right now is a criminal conspiracy with Geithner as part of it to violate the Securities Act of 1933 by deleting information that AIG had proposed to tell the Securities and Exchange Commission, and these filings become public then. Here are the banks we gave the money to, and here's how much they got. $67 billion to these Wall Street banks, London banks, and European banks. And the New York Fed and their lawyers then said, no, don't do that now. Let's not tell that. Now, that's a federal crime right there. So we have an obvious overt act. We have a federal crime, the falsification of a Schedule A filing, which is not a matter of choice. It's something that you've got to do, and these things have got to be done in a timely way, and they've got to be done fully and completely. So before we had Geithner as a tax cheat on, really small sums of money, but now we're up to almost $70 billion in payments to bail out a hedge fund, a deregulated hedge fund with derivatives, which used to be illegal but which have now been brought back. So there is the need for a special prosecutor. We need a federal prosecutor right away to go after Geithner. He should obviously resign or be fired. And above all, we've got to change the policy. You look at that $70 billion, let's call it $70 billion, that has been given to AIG. The actual amount given to AIG, by the way, is more. It's at least $180 billion. So it's about a third.
Yeah, the number I've seen in the news is $220 billion. But going back, Webster, and we'll get into the special prosecutor because that's essential. Everybody needs to listen carefully. Let's not forget, we have record numbers of the Obama administration that don't even pay taxes. You can't work for the IRS if you have any previous tax problem. But here's Geithner saying, I don't even have to pay because it's some international money he was making. I mean, this is just criminals through and through.
Right. This is a criminal gang. I would call this the Mussolini corporate state. Here's a good quote. The liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where the private power becomes stronger than the democratic state itself. That is the essence of fascism, the ownership of government by an individual or a group. Close quote. That's Franklin D. Roosevelt speaking to Congress in 1938. And that's what we have here, that Goldman Sachs and its cohorts in Wall Street have essentially taken over the U.S. government, and they're squeezing it as a cash cow. Let me hasten to add, it's not just Goldman Sachs. I would always want to remind people of the Morgans, because for 150 years, the heart of Wall Street is Morgan. In other words, J.P. Morgan Chase, the Chase Manhattan J.P. Morgan merger. They get as much money or even more than Goldman Sachs, and they take somewhat less political heat. Same thing goes for Morgan Stanley. Morgan Stanley being that other...
Yeah, they're the mob bosses back at the palace getting the money, but the men in there robbing the bank at all the key exits, the gang they hired to rob the bank was Goldman Sachs.
Right, so Goldman Sachs more up front. And, of course, they deserve whatever they get. So I think it's clear that there's been a criminal conspiracy, big violations of federal law. But here's the big thing, I think. You look at, for example, California, right, or New York State. All of these states are now in a tremendous budget crisis, right? Are they going to fire cops? Are they going to fire the fire department?
NBC reports they're making DMV, Department of Motor Vehicles, people work free every Friday. That's called slavery.
Yeah, well, so here we had $70 billion, and really, it's, as you say, it's about $220 billion, 200 plus at least, billion, that were given to AIG for what? For toxic derivatives, for garbage, for junk paper that's absolutely worthless, that doesn't correspond to any kind of economic wealth or value under the...
Okay, stay there, Webster. I want to get into other crimes they've committed, and then how people lobby and push to identify the Wall Street criminals as the literal source, the fount of all of our economic problems.
I fell into a burning ring of fire.
Okay, your calls are coming up. I'm sure they're going to be all over the map. I would ask listeners to try to talk about the Bankster takeover. That's what we're discussing right now. If that's not what you want to talk about, Bankergate, then please let John Harmon know, and I'll go to you later after Webster Tarpley leaves us. But Kyle, Billy, Dave, Jacob, and others, or if you want to call in about the Bankster criminal activities and how we stop them, 1-800-259-9231. We're going back to Webster Tarpley in just a moment. Geithner's been caught red-handed in criminal activity, but we can't just let him be a scapegoat. It is the entire system. We're going to go back to Tarpley here in one moment. First, Webster is really saying nothing new here. He's saying what he said in my film, Fall of the Republic, and the Obama deception. He's going off the facts, and it's now being proven even by the mainstream. So, Webster, I want to move quickly now just to bullet points, picking your brain here. Obviously, we need to have a special prosecutor, but not just Congress. We want grand juries at the state level to indict. We want legislatures that have had their pension funds and other systems defrauded by this who have standing to take action. We need private suits. It is lawsuits that have been bringing out the secret AIG and Goldman Sachs documents where they're engaged in fraud and premeditated plans to blow out their competition and make hundreds of millions of dollars off the scam in McClatchy newspapers. This is all starting to come out, but the public doesn't have a great knowledge. They just know they're being robbed. And then I add the point that it's the banks that run all our major cities that are lobbying for land grabs and more taxes and surveillance. It's the banks that fund the military-industrial complex. It's the banks that are pushing the global Copenhagen tax, where we'll pay money directly to them. I mean, they literally are attempting a global takeover with this wall of fiat currency, 1.5 quadrillion that you talk about, or 1,500 trillion. They are being exposed. They are in trouble. But let's go over more of their crimes, what they've really done, and your expertise in going after these people, the best ways for people to call for their indictments and other crimes they've committed so that the public at large is aware so they can be pushed into the mainstream media.
Well, let's also add another name to our list, right? Because so far we've talked about Hank Paulson. That was the Bush Goldman Sachs Secretary of the Treasury. We're obviously focusing on Geithner, who went from the New York Fed, the flagship of the Federal Reserve System, really the heart of it in terms of policy. But let's also add Sheila Baird of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Now, this woman is also part of the bailout, right? The bailout comes from the Federal Reserve under Bernanke. It comes from the Treasury under Paulson and Geithner. But then Sheila Baird is the head of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Now, she did a couple of things. We've been talking about how sometimes institutions that are viable in themselves are fed into other bankrupt institutions that are politically better connected. The leading example of this is Washington Mutual, and this was the largest savings bank left in the United States that was simply declared bankrupt by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and then fed into J.P. Morgan Chase in order to prop them up. In other words, every indication I have is that WAMU, Washington Mutual, was not bankrupt, but of course J.P. Morgan was because of derivatives. J.P. Morgan is the biggest derivatives black hole in the universe. So this WAMU was seized and fed in, and the people who had that stock were completely destroyed in the process. So that's one thing that we want to investigate.
Yeah, they didn't pay the people off from that. They seized it with real assets, and then the government regulators run by the J.P. Morgan Chase / Goldman Sachs pirate crew